Hi, just a second. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about Docker. So first of all, before we begin, I want people to understand there's a difference between virtual machine and a Docker. So what does it mean? So first I explain what virtual machine is, and then I explain what Docker is, so that's easy for people to understand. So I'll explain what virtual machine now. So virtual machine is basically I'll explain as a CPU here. So we have a CPU. We have CPU and we have assume that there's CPU with 7 CPU cores and 7 GB RAM. Okay, so this is a CPU. This is the computer engine that we have, and we want to segregate a certain portion of it for our own use case. Why? Because if we have a separate compute engine, that's what we call as instance. So if we have a separate instance like this, then we can do our own R&D work or whatever things that we need, and that virtual machine will have its own CPU and RAM only for it. So that's why we have a virtual machine, and the purpose of virtual machine is to segregate a specific environment for its usage. That's why we use virtual machines. That's the main purpose of using a virtual machine. Okay. So what are the disadvantages of it? If you use a virtual machine, there are pros and cons. Pros is we have a separate CPU and we have separate RAM allocated to it. So because of that, we can do whatever we want with that. But the main disadvantage is if I have to assume that we have created a virtual machine called Alpha, and I have to use this Alpha virtual machine anywhere, or I have to use this in a different. Assume that this is made of Linux, and we have used another Linux Ubuntu with 22.4 version here. No, I want to use this Linux Ubuntu 22.4 separately on a Windows PC. For that, what I have to do, I have to create another virtual machine instance space separately so that I can install this here, which is a lot of work. But, so what can we do other than this now? So since we have this issue, what else can we do? We can do another thing. We can use Docker. This is where Docker plays a major role. Why? Because in Docker, you don't have separate CPU allocation or a separate RAM allocation. Nope. You don't have anything like that. But this can be considered as an image. What image here means, it's an executable application. It's like an app. So an app can be run anywhere, right? If we have configured things properly. For example, if we have an application which is specifically designed for iOS, if we have an application specifically designed for Windows or Linux, it can work properly because we have configured executables perfectly. But what if that application itself is Docker? If that application itself is Docker, and all the images that we have runs in the Docker. So with Docker, we create those images, and then those images can be run from any device that we want. So that's how Docker works, actually. So, so what's the main advantage of it? We don't have to have a separate CPU and RAM allocation for it. We can just run it anywhere and deploy it. And this is the foundation of cloud technologies which are currently running. So Docker is basically a container registry. So Docker is a technical term. Docker is an application, it's a product. But what domain or what kind of solution it is providing? It's providing container registry. Container registry. So I'll just Docker is one container registry. There are other options as well, like Helm. These are other competitors, but Docker is the predominant one. That's why most people consider Docker, and they don't. And that's the reason why Docker exists in the first place. So with container registry, here being present, there is surely one thing that we have to understand here. The thing is, this container registry will have images on its own, and those images later on will help us building complex clusters of solutions where we have multiple applications running simultaneously and each having its own endpoints, and that's how cloud architecture works. And I'll explain that later in a different video, which I'll explain more clearly. But here, that's the main purpose of having a Docker. Because if we don't have Docker, what happens is we have to allocate everything in separate virtual machines, and it's difficult for people to just implement things accordingly, because if they have to scale it up, they have to create separate virtual machines on their own. And even though we can automate it, it's more resource constrained, and it's not easier as Docker in terms of scaling up. That's why Docker is preferred. Docker in the sense container registry is preferred, and virtual machines are basically the place where the Dockers are being deployed. So here, what we can do is, in this virtual machine, it can run n number of Docker images. But not vice versa. So virtual machine is basically a computer with a minimum spec, and inside that we can have any kind of Docker images inside. But that's not possible vice versa. So that's the difference between Docker and the virtual machine, and that's the reason why Docker exists. So yeah.